All right, let me tell you about this crazy mission I went on in Ecuador. We were a small group of Army Special Forces soldiers sent on a top-secret operation to gather intel on some mysterious facility. The place was surrounded by barbed wire fences, and what caught our attention right away was the Russian flag waving proudly on one of the buildings. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. As we approached the facility, we couldn't help but notice something strange lurking inside. There was this massive creature, like nothing any of us had ever seen before. Picture an 8-foot-tall dog, but standing on its hind legs. It was muscular, with the kind of build that reminded me of a werewolf from those old horror movies. Yeah, that's exactly what it looked like. Now, our orders were crystal clear. Take photos of whatever was going on in there, but under no circumstances were we to engage with the creature or anyone else. But let me tell you, curiosity got the better of us. We couldn't just ignore this strange beast and the whole operation happening right under our noses. We quietly moved closer, making sure not to alert anyone. It was nerve-wracking, to say the least. The adrenaline was pumping through our veins as we snapped photos of the facility and the creature. We had to document everything, even though we had no clue what it all meant. But then, the unexpected happened. One of my comrades accidentally stepped on a twig, snapping it like a firecracker. Instantly, all hell broke loose. The creature's head snapped towards us, its glowing eyes fixed on our group. It let out a bone-chilling growl that echoed through the night. We were frozen for a moment, but instinct kicked in, and we scrambled to retreat. The creature charged at us, its powerful strides closing the gap with terrifying speed. Bullets whizzed past, but it seemed invulnerable, shrugging off our shots like they were nothing. Fear surged through my veins as I ran, heart pounding in my chest. We needed to find cover, and fast. We ducked behind some crates, desperately trying to catch our breath. The creature circled us, snarling, its sharp teeth glistening in the moonlight. It felt like an eternity, but eventually, we managed to escape. We made it back to our extraction point, battered and bruised, but with the most crucial evidence: the photos. Our mission was complete, but the questions kept haunting us. What was that creature? What were the Russians doing with it? That night in Ecuador will forever be etched in my memory. The encounter with that monstrous creature, the rush of adrenaline, and the lingering mysteries left behind. It was like stepping into a real-life horror story, one that I'll never forget. And trust me, it's a story I won't be sharing around a campfire anytime soon. We thought we heard a woman screaming. That's why we went into the woods. It sounded like a woman plain as day. There had been a few stories about our property being cursed or haunted, and every once in a while that lured out the teenagers. This was something different. This wasn't a joke. My brother grabbed his rifle and I grabbed a flashlight. Whatever was going on with her, the woman's blood-curdling screams meant something was wrong. It was safer to have a weapon on hand. We threw on our jackets and charged into the woods. The autumn chill still nipped at our faces, but we were determined to ignore the weather and to find whoever was out in those trees. They needed our help. Another shriek gave us our direction. We called to them. We made a lot of noise, hoping to guide the woman to us. But the closer we got, and the more we made ourselves known, the quieter the stranger became. The screaming was more spaced out. It faded into a sort of animalistic bleating, then to a whimper. Then she was silent, and we were alone in the trees. We were sure she was there. We wondered if maybe someone or something had made her quiet down. We stupidly decided to split up. Looking back, that was the biggest mistake we could have made. What if the woman had run into trouble? We were just going to shoot our way out or bludgeon the problem with our flashlight. I don't know what we were thinking. I'll be the first to admit that. Hearing someone scared or hurt, hearing it coming from our family's property, we felt compelled to act. We never even considered the alternative. I wish now that we had. After all, it wasn't a woman in those woods. It was just a thing that sounded human. My first glimpse of it was a white flash crossing the beam of my flashlight. It looked like a horse or a cow, but it was moving too quickly for me to get a good look. The trees around me were too tightly spread for an animal that big to navigate them anyway. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The next scream came from directly beside me. I jumped, turned, and tripped over my own legs. Fear quickly turned them into jello. I pedaled backward on my hands, sprawled like a crab on the ground. My flashlight had rolled away from me. When it came to rest, the beam was pointed directly at the thing screaming for our attention. It stood like a man, sure, but it couldn't have been one. Its body, thick and muscular, was covered head to toe in a smoke-white fur. The hair was short and curly, matted close to its body and speckled by leaves and dirt. Its eyes were wide and its jaw protruded from its face like an animal. It didn't have a nose as much as it had two bare nostrils that flared with every breath. Its broad shoulders climbed as it inhaled and watched me. Then it screamed again. I watched its lips peel back to reveal teeth that looked strangely human, arranged in some unnatural way to fit the monster's misshapen mouth. I crouched there, cowering in fear. My hands went up to cover my ears as my eyes began to close. Then the creature's wails were interrupted by a gunshot. You always can count on your siblings, can't you? I heard the bullet sail over my head. The monster gasped and sailed backward, spinning on the heels of its hoved feet. Its back crashed into a tree trunk and it soon crumpled to the ground. It fell out of the flashlight's beam. My brother yelled, asking if I could see it. I couldn't. I dove for the torch and raised it, trying to find the creature in the woods again. We both knew instinctively that the monster wasn't dead. It was too big for one bullet to do the job. I caught the flash of white again, this time stained red, disappearing into the midnight woods. We tried to chase it. Whatever it was, we couldn't let it linger on our property. We resolved to take the thing down and drag it into the light of day. Then we'd figure out what it was. We'd discover the truth behind the massive animal and keep it from scaring anyone else in the process. We picked up its blood trail. We followed it as closely as we could, but eventually it must have stopped bleeding. We recovered a patch of white fur on the tree it first crashed into, but that was the extent of our proof. We had a clump of fur and a frightening story. Neither the hair nor the details we shared convinced much of anyone of the thing in our woods. We tried to put a party together, a group that could track it over the course of a few days. No one wanted any part of monster hunting, go figure. That left the resolution up to us. We set traps. We camped out in the area we'd first seen it. We stayed up all hours of the night listening for the scream. It never came again. We never got another reason to go trekking into those woods. Maybe we were wrong and it only took one bullet after all. My brother and I doubt that. There would have been a body. There would have been remains to find and headlines to write. What we've got is nothing. Fur and a story, but it came to us recently. Maybe what we saw wasn't so one of a kind. Maybe someone else has seen the smoke-white monster in another set of woods. Maybe near to us, who knows? Maybe in another state altogether. Have you seen it? Have you heard it? If so, you only need to say the word. Me and my brother came running once and we'd gladly do it again. Nobody should have to deal with that thing alone. My father wasn't a perfect man. I haven't forgotten the line nights, the loud arguments, or the empty bottles. But I do know, with the benefit of hindsight, that my father did his best. Once upon a time, he might have been good at it. Fatherhood. My mom used to think so. She used to talk about how excited he was when I was born. Then something changed. My mother, my siblings, and even I sometimes liked to pretend that we couldn't remember what changed him. It was easier to tell ourselves that his mind or his heart had just shifted. He'd just become calloused, as tired men sometimes do. But we saw it. We saw what happened to him. How could we forget? It was 20 years ago now. I was young, still in grade school. We were living out in the rural Midwest, on a piece of property that used to be farmland. We couldn't keep up with it. It didn't feel like a loss, admitting that we weren't farmers. Our family made money in other ways, and we did all right financially. What we did miss out on, however, was neighbors. The closest one was miles away. That meant when the night came, we didn't have any witnesses. We were the only ones who could have possibly believed our story. Of course, we did our best to forget it. We were happier pretending they never came. Who wants to live their life afraid of the sky itself? I remember the dry thunder of that summer season. It sounded like the sky was splitting apart as my siblings and I began the bedtime routine of brushing our teeth and avoiding our parents. If they didn't see us right away, sometimes we'd get to stay up an entire half hour before they made us turn the lights out. You had a routine like that too, right? Anyway, we failed. We were spotted early and we found ourselves in the dark soon enough. It would have been easy to sleep. The thunder made it easy, if it wasn't for the lights that appeared just a few minutes later. They burst in through the windows, burning through our blinds as if the fabric wasn't even there. It was suddenly daylight in our room. We ran, confused and frightened, downstairs to meet our parents. Mom stopped us before we could get too far. Dad was already outside. He always told us that one day the soy production plant at the edge of the nearest town might explode. When he told that story, he made it sound like the explosion would be our own little nuclear bomb. That's what I was imagining as I watched my father's silhouette through the front doorway. He was walking into nuclear territory. The lights changed colors and began to swirl. Suddenly it sounded like we were under one constant drone of thunder. I wonder now if the lights had been using the storm as cover, or had they created the storm themselves? It was the perfect camouflage, wasn't it? None of us knew what was coming. We could see our dad in the front lawn. He was looking up, arms down at his sides. He hadn't run out there to play hero, chasing off the invaders on his property. He was in awe. We all were. Then he disappeared. The lights blinked out of existence, the thunder stopped, and Dad was gone. There was an empty spot on the grass where his silhouette had last been. One by one, we wandered out there to search for him. He was nowhere to be found. Our mother called the police and they searched too, but they didn't believe our story about the thunder and the lights. They left us all empty-handed and empty-hearted. None of us went back to bed. 2 days later, after we ran dry of tears, Dad came back. He was disoriented and dehydrated, but hardly worse for wear. He downed 2 full glasses of water and went back to living as normal. When we told him 2 days had passed, he froze. He swallowed something heavy in his throat, then he scoffed. He let it roll off his back like that encounter was just another night. He had nightmares after that. Screamed sometimes, waking up the whole house. I didn't envy my mother, sleeping beside him. He grew distant. He talked less. You've seen somebody shut themselves off before, haven't you? One day they're there and the next day they're just not. The body's still moving, but the mind's somewhere else. That was what happened to our father. There wasn't much we could do to change it, except talk some more with law enforcement and local doctors. We wanted to help him and we wanted to know what happened that night. None of them were any use. Most, as a matter of fact, turned us away. Even the doctors who said they'd take our insurance got cold feet. Sometimes it seemed like they wanted to help and then they just wouldn't. It was like somebody was pulling their leash, you know? They'd try to reach out to us, they'd get real close, and then the world would yank them back. Maybe they were just scared. Maybe someone told them not to help. I'll never know the truth of that. What I do know is that my father did his best, and no other family should have to deal with what we endured. Nobody deserves that, least of all the ones who disappear. Because it's happened to others, you know? It's happened to other people that nobody wants to believe. I guess it requires a certain sacrifice, admitting that there's something unknowable out there. If we hadn't faced it, maybe we'd feel the same way. For now, I just want to warn you. Some people say that these things, when they show up, they're absolutely silent. That wasn't what we encountered. Sometimes they come in the thunder. I am a 20-year veteran in the Forest Service. I've worked as a ranger for 12 years. In all my time working for the government, I mostly never encountered anything too out of the ordinary. That is until my last station job as a ranger at Gooseberry Falls State Park in Minnesota. It was quite possibly one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had while on duty, and certainly not something I'll ever forget. To explain how it happened, we need to go back about 6 months. Before the incident occurred, I had been planning on retiring, but my son had just graduated college and was looking to move closer to Minneapolis. He asked me if he could work part-time with me while he looked for a full-time position, so I decided to pass up retirement and stay on the job. By the way, I should make a note that this was all pre-COVID. I had heard rumors of management positions opening up in the area. So after discussing it with him, we both agreed that he would come back home for around 6 months while he hoped for the perfect job to present itself. I was first introduced to Gooseberry Falls State Park during my orientation as a ranger there, and they took us out into the park at nighttime. It was an amazing sight, getting to see all these bright campfires down below from way above on top of the waterfalls. The rocks from the falls are very smooth and slippery due to years and years of erosion. You have to be careful if you want to climb down to view the falls at night. Our group had just finished our tour and was going to head back towards our cars when one of my co-workers, Tom, suggested that we climb down the falls. Just, for the sake of it. I agreed, but we should have known better. And so did a handful of others who were nearby. As soon as we began climbing down, I sensed something wasn't right. But not wanting to look like I chickened out, I pushed those feelings aside as nothing more than nerves. It started out easy, everyone traveling downward in a single file behind each other, staying close and yet far enough apart for safety's sake. Then, around 3/4 of the way down, things began to get a bit more dangerous. Tom fell. I didn't see him go down, but I heard the commotion. One of my other co-workers had seen what had happened, yelling up to us that he needed help getting Tom back up the rocks. 2 guys rushed down to assist in whatever way they could. And while Tom was being helped back up, one of my female friends called out for help above him, saying she was slipping. It turns out that one part of the path she had been on had given way underneath and sent her tumbling downward. While this may have been scary in and of itself, what happened next could only be described as something straight from a horror movie. We were all standing there in shock at what had just happened when I heard the sound of movement above. I looked up, and there at the top of the ridge was this figure with long dark hair watching us. It was terrifying. It was all in black and had these faint yellow glowing eyes. It was in that moment that I felt my entire body give way, as if I suddenly lost control. The next thing I knew, I too was falling down to the ground below me. Everybody rushed over to help save me, and one guy managed to grab hold of my hand while another wrapped his arms around one leg, for whatever little good that did. They tried pulling me back up, but there was no use. I looked down below, and I could see there were people trying to help Tom, though they weren't having much success. I felt then that there was a possibility that we were going to die right there on those rocks if somebody didn't do something fast. That's when I remember the park ranger telling us about one of the waterfalls in this area being called Lucifer Falls. But for some reason, nobody had ever been able to locate it if they ever climbed down to view it at night. It was said that once you get close enough, you could hear voices, supposedly spirits whispering your name from below. Now, what is most troubling about this story is not so much what happened to me and my co-workers, but what happened with Tom and the female friend. As they were being pulled back up to safety, before either of them could make it out of the water completely, we noticed that their eyes had turned from their normal state into a solid black, It was at this moment that my two co-workers realized that the people they were struggling to help weren't actually Tom or the girl. I'll never forget hearing one of the others in the group scream as he pointed downwards towards, well, whatever it was that our friends had turned into. And yet another guy who was just in front of Tom and his girlfriend jumped back down into the water below to avoid capture. We watched them swim off in the opposite direction, but by this time there was nothing we could do to save them. We never did find out what happened to any of them after that day. I can only assume they were captured and are now being used as some sort of test subjects or something by these demonic creatures. Just looking at my own hands now, I can still see the scars on them from that day. That's why I'm warning you all not to venture down this path at night. As a matter of fact, it might be best just to stay away from these woods entirely during nighttime hours, like we should have. Whatever it is that inhabits these lands does not seem too keen on having people wandering around here at night. But if you do, be careful, for you may soon find that the woods themselves can't tell the difference between friend and foe. Next up is an email I received from Travis. Travis's story goes all the way back to when he was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains back in 2015. His plan was to go camping by himself out in the backcountry, but was worried about not being able to find a suitable place. But he still just wanted to go ahead at the trailhead and hike around and see what he could find. Maybe he could make a makeshift campsite with only his small tent and at least squeeze in a night or two versus figuring out a week-long stay like he had originally planned. The weather was perfect, light winds about 50 or so degrees and partly cloudy, enough for him to enjoy a lovely camping trip. At this point, he had been hiking for probably about 3 or 4 hours and did not see anybody else on the trail. Apparently, that wasn't uncommon for the area since the further you get out on this specific trail, it's much more secluded from civilization. As he continued his trek, he notices something very odd in the forest, and that is the fact that everything around him had begun to grow eerily quiet, besides his own footsteps crunching over twigs and leaves along the trail. And what's also interesting is that this portion of the trail is thick with underbrush on both sides, and usually, at least all throughout the morning, he couldn't hear birds singing or wildlife erupting with noise and life. It's as if they had all fled or just seemed to be hiding and keeping low. The deeper into the woods he traversed, the more eerie things became, and the more his hairs on the back of his neck began to prickle like something was wrong. And the more he realized that it's like every living creature had vacated this part of nature. He hated to think about it, but all he could envision was rats leaving a sinking ship. At this point, he felt almost in a fishbowl in a sense, even though he was completely alone and hadn't seen anybody on the trail that day. He felt as though the woods were watching him, and every so often he would hear what sounded like footsteps crunching through the forest behind him, almost as if someone was tailing him. And every time he turned around to investigate, there was no one there. It was as if he was being stalked by some invisible entity. After some time, his paranoia grew stronger, and he couldn't take it anymore. He turned around and began to head back towards the trailhead, hoping to put as much distance between himself and whatever was out there. He walked faster, almost jogging back towards the trailhead, and as he did, he felt a sudden gust of wind behind him, as if something was right on his heels. He turned around and saw nothing, but the feeling persisted, and it only intensified his fear. He picked up his pace and finally reached the trailhead, relieved to be out of the woods. But as he turned to look back one last time, he saw a figure standing among the trees, barely visible and staring at him. The figure was tall and slender, with long arms and an unnaturally elongated neck. The figure's eyes glowed with an intense light, and Travis could feel its gaze piercing through him. He quickly turned away and got into his car, driving off as fast as he could, leaving the Appalachian Mountains behind him. Travis's encounter in the Appalachian Mountains left him deeply shaken, and he couldn't explain what he had seen. He didn't dare to return to those woods again, and he warned others to stay away as well. To this day, he believes he came face to face with something supernatural, something that lurks in the depths of the Appalachian Mountains.